Hey, thanks for joining me again on Tales of the Trade. I'm Chirag Desai. This episode is a continuation of my conversation with Ramsey Tesdell focused on the podcast landscape. If you haven't yet, you can listen to our main episode in your podcast feed right before this one. On our main episode, Ramsey shared some of South's growth plans, including their acquisitions of Finial Media and Rising Giants Network. I also spoke to him about some of the opportunities and challenges for the regional podcast landscape.
I don't know how much merger acquisition consolidation will happen or should happen. I think it's interesting that there's a couple of like pins. There's a couple of kind of hubs, networks and companies that are working and doing, and then there's a bunch of independent stuff too. And so I think there's ways that we can engage with the independent
Sure.
podcasts as well. I think that's something that's interesting. And then if you think about podcasts, the podcast industry has three kind of main pillars, right? You have the content, you have the tech, and you have the monetization. If you look at those three, Salt has been almost entirely focused on the content side of that. And that is something that we're, for the most part, mostly focused on. The other parts, we're working with partners on to build out, the required, requirements for those other pillars. So I think there's still a lot of room to grow. And for us as like, if we consider ourselves as like a ecosystem partner, then, our goal as well is to grow the whole ecosystem. So we want that whole pie to grow. So, when you have a company close down, this makes me very sad. It's not something that we celebrate and something that, oh, some competition. Now there's, no, this is not a good thing. This is a bad thing for the ecosystem. We want that ecosystem to grow fully and together. So this is something that, that we keep an eye on and that we're tracking. And I think it's really good to see that there's a couple of new players, some new networks, a lot of individual podcasts popping up. And those are all healthy signs.
For me, I think there are some very visible gaps in the ecosystem, especially regionally. Right, education is a big one, of course. I still think there's also a lack of content. There isn't enough yet, right?
I would agree with that.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, there's a lot of space to grow. I think we're still kind of figuring out a lot of the pieces of the puzzles. I think we're taking, at least I know, because we've spoken about it. I think we're taking a lot of like global learnings to see, certain things why they don't work.
Right.
But I'd love to get your thoughts on what you think are maybe some of the gaps or some of the challenges that are still, we're still not down addressing.
I mean, I would agree. We haven't reached anywhere close to a saturation of podcasts in the region. And when I say in the region, like I mean in our geographic region, but also in the languages of our region.
Sure.
And many languages, not just English or Arabic. There's other languages as well. So I think that's really important to consider. And I think too, if you look at really successful ecosystems, like TikTok or Instagram or whatnot, there is a financial element that is in there. And so I think that's something that we're still lacking. There isn't that financial reward. It doesn't, but I also think that there's other rewards. And so, for us, like I said, having a productive conversation is really important in this day and age for our societies. No matter how you see that society, like it's really
Absolutely.
important to have
Yeah.
productive conversations with each other. So that's something that we think is a core piece of that. I would also say, the debate or the conversation about audio and video is almost pointless and not very useful. I think there's different types of content, and when we say podcast, we mean a podcast. Like it means like people talking or narrative, whether they're video or not video.
I'm with you on the video audio conversation too, right? I think there's so much energy that's spent on that conversation that it's for me it's very clear, right? I think it works for some shows, it doesn't work for others. You have to figure out if there's a fit, there's an overhead that you add that it may or may not be worth it depending on the kind of show you're doing and depending on the economics of I mean, there's it is a business decision to a large degree,
Right.
And then in some cases it's a very easy business decision, and others it's not actually, right?
I think they're both useful and interesting and can be extremely sticky. People will want to listen to that and come back to it. So we're doing, more video, but we're also our narrative shows are the audiences are growing. Our audience doubled from 2022 to 2023. We're going to try to double that again in 2024. So we don't see those issues in the sense that, the numbers are smaller or whatnot. I would say, you know, there probably are, very few examples of podcast tech projects in the region,
I don't know why that is, but it is, yeah.
right? Maybe there's just like two or three different kind of tech projects that I know about, and one of them, is a recent kind of transformation, Thamenya, from more of a content company
Right.
to a web content tech company.
Sure.
And then there's a couple of others that started and stayed in the tech area. And then so I think there's those two, and then if you follow that kind of three pillars of the podcast ecosystem, I would say there's probably not enough monetization opportunities happening either. And that's probably something we can agree on. And so there needs to be more people working in that as well. More education. And like I said, the goal is to grow that pie. It's not just to get a bigger piece of a small pie, but it's to make that whole pie much bigger.
There is something to be said about the RSS part of podcasting that is
Mm,
actually very powerful and impactful and I think to some degree also contributes to the challenges we're seeing, right? Because there
right,
you can't consolidate something that isn't consolidatable, if that's a
right,
word, right?
right,
So when you mentioned TikTok as an example, it is still a closed ecosystem. Everything happens inside the platform, and it makes it faster to grow in terms of looking at an ecosystem. But then, of course, it comes with its own challenges, right? Whether it's and we've seen this in YouTube and so many other platforms where you have issues because the platform's goals don't always align with the creator's goals, right?
right.
That I'm sure you've had these conversations with actually not just advertisers but just companies, right? Where it's like that's all the data we're going to get, and I'm like, yeah, that's all the data you're going to get, but this is good enough to
Yeah,
get somewhere with what you're trying to do, because it's a very, as you said, it's a sticky listen, right?
right,
So of course there's education that has to happen around that.
right.
So I think that's where kind of things have to still move. Like you mentioned, monetization is a big deal, and I think it isn't quite mature enough yet. And we're not. Again, it's very easy to look at places like the US, but they're very mature in terms of things like subscriptions for content and in every tier. And here, it's not just enough to have a subscription; we also have to educate.
Yeah, I would, obviously agree with a lot of that. And I think, we've seen some attempts to create walled gardens around open technology,
Yeah,
Spotify being the biggest. They're trying to get a lot of that content into there and exclusive and whatnot. And they've, recently kind of unrolled that.
I think that was always going to be the case. I mean, I think there'll always be some space for sort of the quote unquote walled garden, right? I think there will be
Yeah,
some room for someone to come in, get a bunch of audience, and say, okay, well, now you can only get this within my whatever it is, right? Platform, gate, whatever.
right,
But I think the larger ecosystem and everything else around it will continue to thrive, irrespective
right.
of what happens there. I don't think you're going to see, at least I can't see it happening where 98% of podcast listening is going to happen on one platform, and then
Right.
there's going to be nothing else.
I mean, you had other examples too where people were trying to bring all the content into an app, and spent, tons of money. I think it was called Luminary, right? Where they spent
Yes.
all this money to get all this content, and they had like very few subscribers. I think they killed it so quickly that they realized so quickly that this is not gonna work, and so they jumped on like Apple Podcast subscription, and I think moving forward, what I would like to see is more distribution of the revenue, from advertising and sponsorships to subscription. And I think subscription can add value, and I think there will be certain ways and places where subscription is going to be an important part, of our businesses. And I think for Salt, we are going to relaunch Salt Plus with a different strategy, in the
Okay.
coming 2 months. And we're also going to launch a couple of new products that are going to be subscription only, and we're going to really go and we're going to drill down on that. And we think we found a couple of audio products that work best in subscription and not, freemium or another other way. There's certain places you don't want advertising. There's certain
Hmm.
things that you do not want, exposure to brands and to kind of, whatever ad server delivers at that moment. And so we're going to look at some of those opportunities and see what we can build that could be, financially successful. And also, again, remembering that quality and the content is really important, and how those two things can meet in subscription. So we're also going to focus on that, a lot in the coming year. And we're going to test some things out and see how it goes.
Yeah, and I think it is that sort of essential pivot to content company, right? Versus calling
Mm,
yourself a podcast house. I mean, this is I love podcasts, and I don't mean that they're going anywhere, right? But I think the idea of from a business standpoint, thinking one level up, right? To say, okay, here's a piece of content that I want to be able to deliver, and then figure out what's the best way to do it. And that might be two
right.
different forms of audio. It can be audio or video. It can be. I mean, I think there's a lot of scope to start thinking strategically that way.
Right.
I think the listeners are pretty primed to want to pick up things, right? The question is, how do you best deliver it? And there's a nice balance you can strike there.
Right.
That was my bonus episode with Ramsey Tesdell, Tales of the Trade, brought to you by MENA Media. I'm Chirag Desai. We'll see you again soon.